Teen returns from surgery with terrifying prophecies, near-death experience. The sterile scent of antiseptics filled the air as the operating room hummed with quiet urgency. Nurses moved swiftly, their gloved hands checking machines and organizing instruments. A steady rhythm beeped from the heart monitor, a subtle reminder that life hung in the balance. On the table lay 16-year-old Ethan Parker, his youthful face pale against the backdrop of the bright surgical lights. "Let's begin," said Dr. Patel, the lead surgeon, her voice calm but commanding. She adjusted her gloves and gave the anesthesiologist a nod. Ethan's mother, Laura, stood just outside the operating room, her palms pressed against the small window in the door. She had barely slept since learning that her son would need emergency surgery to repair a brain aneurysm. The doctors had assured her it was a routine procedure, but the word routine meant nothing when it was your child lying unconscious under a scalpel. Inside the room, Ethan's world had already begun to dim. The anesthesia took hold, pulling him under with a weight he couldn't resist. The lights blurred, and the voices of the surgeons and nurses faded into an eerie silence. And then, everything stopped. Ethan's body lay lifeless on the table, but his consciousness felt unmoored. He wasn't in the operating room anymore. At first, it was just darkness, a void so profound that it seemed to stretch forever. Then, without warning, the blackness gave way to light. It wasn't the blinding white light people always described in stories of near-death experiences. No, this was different. It was cold, flickering, and tinged with shadows. Ethan felt himself standing, or maybe floating, in an unfamiliar place. The ground beneath him wasn't solid, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Ahead, he saw faint shapes moving in the distance, indistinct but undeniably there. A chill ran through him as the shapes grew closer, and he realized they weren't just shadows. They were people, or at least they used to be. "Ethan," a voice called, sharp and low, like a whisper carried on the wind. He turned, his heart pounding despite the absence of his body. The figure before him was tall and cloaked in darkness, its face obscured. It didn't move closer but seemed to tower over him nonetheless, its presence suffocating. "You're not supposed to be here yet," the figure said, its voice echoing unnaturally. "But you've been given a glimpse." "A glimpse of what?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. He didn't remember speaking, the words seemed to form on their own. The figure raised an arm, pointing to something behind Ethan. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his gut. In the distance, he saw scenes unfolding, like fragments of a shattered mirror reflecting pieces of the future. People were screaming, their faces contorted with fear. Cities burned, the sky blackened with smoke, and the ground cracked open beneath them. "What is this?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "The world as it will be," the figure replied. Unless the warnings are heeded, Ethan wanted to run, to wake up, to do anything to escape the nightmare unraveling before him. But his feet wouldn't move, and his eyes couldn't look away. The visions grew more vivid, more terrifying. He saw a face, a girl he recognized but couldn't place, crying out for help as chaos erupted around her. He saw his own family, his mother and younger sister, standing in a crowd of frightened people, their faces pale with terror. "No," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. "This can't be real. It can't be." "It is," the figure said simply. "And it is not set in stone. You have a choice, Ethan." "A choice?" he asked, his voice rising. "What kind of choice?" "I don't understand." Before the figure could answer, the ground beneath Ethan shifted violently, as though the world itself was rebelling against him. The light grew blinding, and the sounds of chaos reached a deafening crescendo. Ethan clutched his head, overwhelmed by the intensity of it all. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Back in the operating room, the heart monitor let out a shrill, continuous beep, signaling cardiac arrest. "We're losing him," one of the nurses shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. Dr. Patel's hands flew to the defibrillator paddles. "Charge to 200, she ordered. "Clear." Ethan's body jolted as the electric shock surged through him. The monitor flickered, then steadied into a slow, irregular rhythm. "Heart rate is stabilizing," the anesthesiologist said, his voice tight with relief. Laura, still standing outside the room, saw the flurry of activity and felt her knees go weak. A nurse rushed over to steady her. "He's going to be okay," the nurse said quickly, though her eyes betrayed her concern. Inside, Ethan's eyes fluttered open for the briefest moment. He was back, but the images of what he had seen lingered, burned into his mind like an indelible mark. His lips moved faintly, forming words no one in the room could hear. "The warnings," he whispered, before the darkness claimed him again. Ethan woke in the recovery room with a jolt, his body slick with sweat despite the cool air around him. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breathing was shallow. The sharp smell of antiseptic hit his nose, anchoring him back to reality. For a moment, he thought everything he had experienced, the void, the figure, the warnings, was just a vivid dream brought on by the anesthesia. But then the images came rushing back. Cities consumed by flames. Faces twisted in terror. The figure's cold, resonant voice. The world as it will be. Unless the warnings are heeded. His hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the hospital bed. Every time he blinked, the visions replayed behind his eyelids, more vivid than anything his imagination could conjure. This wasn't a dream. He knew it. It had felt too real, too immediate. "Ethan?" The voice pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to see his mother standing by his bedside. Her face was pale and lined with worry, her eyes red as though she'd been crying for hours. "You're awake," she said, relief washing over her face. She leaned forward and brushed the damp hair from his forehead. "How are you feeling?" Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and his words came out in a croak. "Water," he managed to rasp. Laura immediately grabbed a plastic cup from the bedside table and helped him take a sip. The cool liquid soothed his parched throat, but it did nothing to ease the storm raging in his mind. "I was so scared," she said, her voice trembling. "The doctors said there were complications, and for a moment, they thought they might lose you." Ethan's gaze flickered to the machines beeping steadily beside him. He could still feel the echoes of the figure's presence, as though it were lingering just outside the edges of his perception. He wanted to tell her everything, to unload the weight pressing on his chest, but the words wouldn't come. "I'm fine," he lied, his voice hoarse but steady. "Just tired." Laura studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing. "You look different," she said quietly. "Like something's bothering you. Did you have a bad dream or something?" Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. What could he possibly say that wouldn't make him sound insane? That he had glimpsed the end of the world? That he had spoken to a shadowy figure warning him about a future filled with terror and destruction? "It's nothing," he said finally, forcing a weak smile. "Probably just the anesthesia messing with my head." Laura didn't look convinced, but before she could press further, the door opened and a nurse walked in. She was tall and efficient looking, with a clipboard in hand and a brisk demeanor that left little room for questions. "Good to see you awake, Ethan," the nurse said, her tone professional. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," Ethan replied automatically, his voice flat. The nurse nodded, checking the monitors beside his bed. "We'll need to run a few more tests to make sure everything's okay, but you're stable now. That's the most important thing." She glanced at Laura. "You can step out for a bit if you'd like. The doctor will be by soon to discuss Ethan's recovery plan." Laura looked reluctant, but she nodded. She leaned down and kissed Ethan's forehead. "I'll be right outside," she said softly before leaving the room. As soon as the door closed, the nurse turned back to Ethan, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Did you experience anything unusual during the surgery?" she asked, her voice carefully measured. Ethan stiffened, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "It's not uncommon for patients undergoing brain surgery to report vivid dreams or hallucinations," the nurse said, her tone neutral. "Sometimes they feel very real, but it's just the brain's way of processing stress." Her explanation sounded rehearsed, almost too casual, and Ethan's unease deepened. He studied her face, trying to determine if she was fishing for information or if she knew something he didn't. "I don't remember much," he lied, keeping his expression as blank as possible. The nurse's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she jotted something down on her clipboard. "If you do remember anything, let us know," she said, her tone dismissive. "It can help us monitor your recovery." With that, she left the room, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. He let out a shaky breath, his heart still racing. There was something off about her question, something that made him feel like his experience was more than just a random hallucination. Did she know? Ethan's thoughts spiraled as he stared at the ceiling. The figure's words echoed in his mind, louder now. Unless the warnings are heeded. What warnings? How was he supposed to stop something so massive, so terrifying, when he didn't even understand what he had seen? Later that evening, Ethan's hospital room was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of a single bedside lamp. Laura had gone home to check on Ethan's younger sister, promising to return first thing in the morning. Ethan lay awake, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching him. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, denser, as though they were alive. He turned his head, his breath hitching when he thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. But when he focused on it, there was nothing there. His pulse quickened. The air in the room felt heavier, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. He reached for the call button, but before he could press it, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. His breath fogged in front of him, and the light from the bedside lamp flickered. "Ethan?" The voice was faint but unmistakable. He froze, his eyes darting around the room. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice trembling. There was no response, but the shadows in the corner seemed to grow darker, denser, until they formed a shape. It was the figure from his visions, towering and cloaked in darkness. "You've been given a task," it said, its voice low and resonant. "The time to act is now." "I don't know what you want me to do," Ethan said, his voice rising in panic. "I don't understand any of this." The figure didn't move, its presence filling the room like a suffocating fog. "You will understand. The warnings cannot go unheard. The consequences are not yours alone to bear." Ethan's heart raced as the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving the room eerily silent. He clutched the sheets tightly, his mind reeling. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't over. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the hospital blinds, casting pale streaks across the sterile room. Ethan sat upright in bed, his hands gripping the thin blanket as though it might tether him to reality. The weight of the previous night pressed on him like a leaden fog. The figure's presence lingered in his mind, its words repeating with haunting clarity, "The warnings cannot go unheard." There was no denying it now. This wasn't just a dream or a trick of his stressed mind. Whatever he had experienced, it was real. And if the visions had been real, then so were the terrifying images of destruction. A soft knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. Laura peeked in, her face brightening when she saw him awake. She carried a bag of his favorite snacks and a fresh change of clothes, her attempt to inject normalcy into an otherwise surreal situation. "How's my boy doing today?" she asked, her tone cheerful but lined with exhaustion. "I'm okay," Ethan replied automatically, though the tightness in his voice betrayed him. Laura set the bag on the small bedside table and pulled up a chair. She studied him carefully, her motherly instincts kicking in. "You don't seem okay," she said gently. "What's going on, Ethan?" He hesitated, his mind racing for a plausible explanation. He wanted to tell her everything, about the visions, the figure, the warnings, but the words felt like lead in his throat. How could he explain something so unimaginable without sounding insane? "It's just the surgery," he said finally, looking down at his hands. "It's a lot to process." Laura nodded slowly, reaching out to place a comforting hand on his arm. "I get that," she said. "You've been through so much and it's okay to feel overwhelmed. But you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here for you." Ethan forced a small smile, grateful for her support but unable to shake the feeling that he couldn't burden her with the truth. Later that day, Ethan was taken for routine post-op tests. The nurses wheeled him down long, winding corridors, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead a dull backdrop to his swirling thoughts. Each room they passed felt suffocating, the weight of the visions pressing on him more with every turn of the wheels. When they finally stopped in a small, dimly lit lab, a technician greeted him with a polite but distracted smile. She was a middle-aged woman with short, cropped hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "We're just going to run a quick scan to make sure everything looks good," she said, gesturing to the MRI machine. "Shouldn't take more than 20 minutes." Ethan nodded mutely as the nurses helped him onto the table. He lay flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling as the machine whirred to life around him. The soft hum of the MRI was oddly hypnotic, and for a moment, Ethan felt his mind drift. But as the scan progressed, a faint, high-pitched ringing began to grow in his ears. At first, he thought it was part of the machine's noise, but it quickly became unbearable, like nails scraping against glass. "Stop the machine!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The technician's voice came through a speaker. "Ethan, are you okay? What's wrong?" I can't." His words faltered as the ringing gave way to something else. Voices. Dozens of them, whispering and overlapping, their words indistinct but frantic. The room around him seemed to blur, and for a terrifying moment he was no longer in the lab. He was back in the void, the darkness pressing in on him. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and he realized they were calling his name. "Ethan?" He turned frantically, searching for the source of the voices, but the void remained empty. Then, out of the darkness, a single face emerged. It was a woman, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth moving as though she was screaming, but no sound came out. Ethan tried to reach for her, but his arms wouldn't move. The scene shifted rapidly, and now he was surrounded by chaos. Fires raging, buildings collapsing, people running in all directions. In the middle of it all, the figure stood silently watching him. "Do you see now?" it said, its voice cutting through the cacophony like a knife. "The future demands your voice. The choice will come soon." Before Ethan could respond, the darkness shattered like glass, and he was back in the MRI machine. The technician was hovering over him, her face etched with concern. "Ethan, are you okay? You were yelling." He blinked up at her, his chest heaving as though he had just run a marathon. "I'm fine," he lied, his voice hoarse. "Just a bad dream." The technician didn't look convinced, but she nodded and stepped back, giving him space to sit up. Ethan's hands were shaking as he climbed off the table. The voices were gone, but their urgency still rang in his ears. When Ethan returned to his room, he found his best friend, Mason, waiting for him. Mason was sitting cross-legged in the visitor's chair, a bag of chips in one hand and his phone in the other. "Dude, you look like you've seen a ghost," Mason said, glancing up with a grin. "You okay?" Ethan tried to smile, but it felt hollow. "Yeah," he said. "Just tired." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Tired, or freaked out because they drilled into your brain?" "Because honestly, both are valid." Ethan let out a weak laugh, grateful for Mason's humor but too drained to engage fully. He sat on the edge of the bed, his mind still replaying the figure's words. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, right?" Mason asked, his tone more serious now. Ethan hesitated, his stomach twisting. He wanted to confide in Mason, to share the burden of what he'd seen, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. "Not yet." "Yeah," he said finally. "I tell you." Mason nodded, seeming satisfied for the moment. He tossed Ethan a candy bar from his bag. "Here, eat something. You look like you're about to pass out." Ethan caught it and unwrapped it mechanically, his appetite non-existent. As he stared at the wrapper, the whispers from the void echoed faintly in his mind. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself forever, but the weight of the truth felt too heavy to share. For now, he would carry it alone. The following days blurred into a haze of hospital routines, nurses checking his vitals, doctors reviewing his progress, visitors coming and going with careful smiles. On the surface, Ethan appeared to be recovering well. His surgical scars were healing, his strength was slowly returning, and the medical team seemed satisfied with his physical progress. But Ethan knew something was wrong. The visions, the voices, the shadowy figure, they weren't fading like dreams typically did. If anything, they were becoming clearer, more insistent. The images of destruction flashed in his mind every time he closed his eyes. He could still hear the whispers, faint but constant, like static in the background of his thoughts. He felt watched, as though the shadows in every corner of his room were alive, waiting for him to notice them. On the fourth night after his surgery, Ethan woke with a start, his chest heaving as though he'd just surfaced from deep water. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the heart monitor beside him. Sweat clung to his skin, and his throat was dry. He reached for the cup of water on his bedside table but froze mid-motion. Something was wrong. The room felt the air was colder than it should have been, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. His instincts screamed at him to stay still, but his eyes darted to the far corner of the room. It was there. The figure stood in the corner, its dark form blending seamlessly with the shadows. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room, oppressive and unyielding. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and he clenched the blanket tightly in his fists. "Why are you here?" he demanded, his voice shaky but laced with defiance. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering his question. When it spoke, its voice was as cold and resonant as before. "Because the time is drawing near. You must prepare." "Prepare for what?" Ethan snapped, his frustration outweighing his fear. "You keep talking in riddles, but you're not telling me anything I can actually use. What do you want from me?" The figure took a single step forward, its movements deliberate and slow. "You have seen the future," it said. "You know what is coming. The warnings have been given. Now, it is your responsibility to act." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "How am I supposed to act on something I don't understand? What am I supposed to do?" "You will know when the time comes," the figure replied. "But you must not ignore the signs. The choice will be yours, Ethan. And the consequences will affect more than just you." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the shadows in the room shifted violently. The figure dissolved into darkness, and the oppressive air lifted, leaving the room eerily silent. The only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor and the faint rustle of the blanket as Ethan's trembling hands released it. He sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. The figure's words echoed in his head, heavy with implications he didn't fully understand. "The choice will be yours." The choice? What signs was he supposed to look for? And how could he possibly shoulder this responsibility when he didn't even know where to begin? The next morning, Ethan tried to push the encounter from his mind, but the weight of it lingered. Mason visited again, bringing an arsenal of snacks and video games in an effort to cheer him up. For a while, the distraction worked. They played on Mason's handheld console, laughing and trash-talking like they always did. But even as Ethan forced himself to smile, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Every so often, his eyes would dart to the corners of the room, half expecting the figure to reappear. Mason noticed his unease and paused the game. "All right, spill it," Mason said, crossing his arms. "You've been weird ever since the surgery." "What's going on?" Ethan hesitated, his stomach twisting. He wanted to tell Mason the truth, desperately, but fear held him back. What if Mason didn't believe him? What if he thought Ethan was losing his mind? Or worse, what if telling Mason put him in danger too? "It's nothing," Ethan said, forcing a weak smile. "Just the surgery stuff, I guess. My brain's still catching up." Mason frowned but didn't press the issue. "All right," he said reluctantly. "But if you ever feel like talking, you know I'm here, right?" Ethan nodded, grateful for his friend's loyalty even if he couldn't bring himself to take advantage of it. For now, the burden was his alone to carry. That night, the visions returned with a vengeance. Ethan dreamed of fires consuming entire cities, of people running and screaming as the ground cracked beneath their feet. He saw flashes of faces, strangers and loved ones alike, twisted with fear and pain. And always, in the background, was the figure, watching silently. When he woke, his pillow was damp with sweat, and his heart was pounding. He sat up in bed, clutching his head as though he could physically block the images from invading his mind. The whispers were louder now, their words still indistinct but their urgency unmistakable. Ethan buried his face in his hands, his frustration boiling over. "What do you want from me?" he whispered fiercely. "Why me? Why can't you just leave me alone?" There was no answer, only the faint hum of the machines beside him. But as he sat there, his breathing ragged, a strange calm settled over him. It wasn't relief, it was resignation. He couldn't ignore this anymore. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't going to stop. The warnings weren't going to go away. He had to figure out what they meant. The next day, Ethan requested to see Dr. Patel. She arrived in the early afternoon, her usual calm demeanor intact. She reviewed his chart, nodded at his progress, and then asked if he had any questions. "Have you ever heard of someone seeing things during surgery?" Ethan asked cautiously. Dr. Patel glanced up from the chart, her expression unreadable. "It's not uncommon," she said slowly. "Some patients report vivid dreams or hallucinations, especially during procedures involving the brain." "Why do you ask?" Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I think I saw something. It felt real. Too real." Dr. Patel set the chart aside and leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes the brain processes stress or trauma in unusual ways," she said. "It can create experiences that feel very real, even if they aren't. But if this is troubling you, we can explore it further." Ethan nodded, though her answer didn't reassure him. Whatever he had experienced, it wasn't just his brain playing tricks. He was certain of that. Dr. Patel stood to leave, but before she did, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "If you ever want to talk about what you saw, I'm here to listen," she said. Sometimes just saying it out loud can help. Ethan watched her leave, conflicted. He appreciated her concern, but this wasn't something that could be explained with science or talked away. It was something much darker, much bigger than himself. As the door closed behind her, Ethan made a silent promise to himself. He would figure out the meaning of the visions. And when the signs came, he would be ready. The hospital felt suffocating that night. Ethan couldn't sleep. The buzzing fluorescent lights above his bed, the faint murmur of nurses down the hall, and the distant hum of machines seemed to press in on him, amplifying the tension building in his chest. The visions hadn't stopped. If anything, they were growing stronger. Each one carried fragments of destruction, burning cities, faces he recognized but couldn't name, and the constant, looming presence of the shadowy figure. He turned restlessly, his heart racing as the room seemed to close in around him. The whispers were louder now, overlapping and relentless, like 100 voices speaking at once. He couldn't make out their words, but their urgency was unmistakable. It was as if they were trying to tell him something vital. "Enough!" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking through the quiet of the room. The whispers stopped. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. For the first time in days, the oppressive noise in his mind was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, an almost physical force pressing down on him. Then, the shadows in the room began to move. Ethan's eyes widened as the darkness in the far corner of his room shifted and coalesced. Slowly, the shadowy figure emerged, its presence filling the space with a chilling, palpable weight. It stood tall and unyielding, its form blending seamlessly with the shadows around it. "You're back," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Why won't you leave me alone?" The figure didn't respond immediately. It stepped closer, its movements deliberate and unnerving. When it spoke, its voice was cold and resonant, echoing in a way that made the room feel smaller. "You've ignored the warnings long enough, Ethan," it said. "The time has come to act. I don't understand what you want from me." Ethan snapped, his fear giving way to frustration. "You keep talking about warnings and choices, but you're not telling me anything I can use. How am I supposed to act if I don't even know what I'm supposed to do?" The figure tilted its head as if studying him. "You have been chosen," it said simply. Ethan blinked, his mind reeling. "Chosen for what?" "To see what others cannot," the figure replied. "To warn them of what is to come." The weight of its words settled over Ethan like a crushing wave. He shook his head, his voice rising. "You've got the wrong person. I'm just a kid. I don't know how to stop whatever this is. I don't even know where to start." "You were not chosen by chance," the figure said. "The visions you've seen, the voices you've heard, they are not random. They are pieces of a greater truth. A truth you must uncover." Ethan clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath his fear. "You keep saying that like it's supposed to mean something. But I don't have the answers. I don't know what to do." The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. "You will find the answers if you look. The warnings are not just for you, they are for the world. And the consequences of ignoring them will be catastrophic." Ethan's breath hitched. He thought of the visions, the fires, the destruction, the terrified faces. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why not someone else? Someone stronger? Smarter? The figure loomed over him, its voice unyielding. Because you see what others cannot. You were brought to the edge of death and returned so that you could carry this burden. This is your purpose? The room fell into an oppressive silence. Ethan's heart raced as the figure's words echoed in his mind. He wanted to deny it, to reject the weight of what was being placed on him. But deep down, a part of him knew the figure was right. The visions weren't random, and neither was his survival. He had been brought back for a reason. Fine, Ethan said finally, his voice trembling. You want me to warn people? To stop this from happening? Then tell me how. Give me something I can use. The figure stepped back slightly, its form blending into the shadows once more. The signs are already around you, it said. Pay attention. Follow the threads. The truth is closer than you think. Before Ethan could respond, the figure dissolved into darkness, leaving the room cold and silent. Ethan sat frozen, his mind racing. He had no idea what the figure meant, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore the visions anymore. If there were signs, he needed to find them. The next morning, Ethan was discharged from the hospital. Laura was relieved to bring him home, eager to return to normalcy. She spent the day fussing over him, cooking his favorite meals and making sure he was comfortable. Ethan appreciated her efforts, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the figure's words, about the signs he was supposed to find. That night, as he lay in bed, the whispers returned. They were softer this time, less chaotic, as though they were waiting for him to listen. He closed his eyes and focused, trying to make sense of the indistinct murmurs. Slowly, the whispers began to take shape. Follow the girl. Find the source. Beware the darkness. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. The girl, he whispered. He thought back to the visions. Among the chaos and destruction, there had been a girl, a face he couldn't place but felt like he should recognize. He sat up, his mind racing. Who was she? And what did she have to do with the warnings? As he tried to piece it together, a sudden realization hit him. A week before his surgery, he had overheard his mother talking about a neighbor's daughter who had gone missing. She'd been a quiet girl, someone Ethan had only spoken to a few times in passing. Her disappearance had shocked the neighborhood, but Ethan hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, the memory felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. The girl, he murmured again. Could she be the key to understanding the warnings? Was she connected to the chaos he had seen in the visions? The whispers grew louder, almost encouraging, as though they were urging him forward. Ethan knew he couldn't ignore them anymore. If the figure was right and the signs were already around him, then this girl might be the first thread he needed to pull. Taking a deep breath, he made a silent promise to himself. He would find her, and he would uncover the truth. No matter how terrifying it might be. Ethan sat at his desk, the soft glow of his laptop casting long shadows across the room. He scrolled through endless pages of news articles, forum threads, and social media posts, his eyes scanning for any mention of the missing girl. Her name was Lily Harper, a quiet, studious teenager who had lived just a few blocks away from him. The more Ethan read about her, the more he felt the pull of something he couldn't explain, something that told him she was the key to the warnings. Every detail about Lily's disappearance felt strange. She had vanished without a trace 3 weeks earlier, leaving behind a half-finished cup of tea on her desk and a book open to the middle of a chapter. Her parents had reported no signs of struggle, no forced entry. One moment she was there, and the next she wasn't. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The whispers had been clear, follow the girl. But how was he supposed to follow someone who had seemingly disappeared off the face of the earth? He glanced at his phone, hesitating before typing a text to Mason. Ethan, you know anything about Lily Harper? Mason's reply came almost instantly. Mason, the girl who went missing? Yeah, my mom's been talking about it nonstop. But Ethan hesitated, then replied, just curious. Thinking about checking out her place tomorrow. Maybe there's something the cops missed. There was a long pause before Mason's next text. Mason, dude, what? Are you serious? That's creepy. Just let it go. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't let it go, not when the whispers were pushing him towards something bigger. He turned off his phone, his resolve hardening. If Mason didn't understand, that was fine. Ethan would figure it out on his own. The next morning, Ethan stood outside the Harper house, his stomach twisting with nerves. The house was eerily quiet, the curtains drawn tight against the sunlight. He felt a pang of guilt for intruding on the privacy of a grieving family, but the urgency in his chest outweighed his hesitation. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Moments later, a weary-looking woman answered, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Ethan recognized her from the neighborhood, a kind woman who always smiled and waved, now a shell of her former self. "Mrs. Harper," Ethan began awkwardly, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry to bother you. I wanted to ask if there's anything I can do to help. I know Lily's missing and I thought maybe—" Her expression softened slightly, though the pain in her eyes remained. "That's very kind of you, Ethan," she said quietly. "But there's nothing anyone can do right now. The police are doing everything they can." "I know," Ethan said quickly. I was wondering if I could look around her room. Maybe there's something someone missed. I know it's a long shot, but—" Mrs. Harper hesitated, her gaze searching his face. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said. "But please be careful. Her room's exactly the way she left it. I haven't been able to bring myself to move anything." Ethan followed her inside, his heart pounding. Lily's room was at the end of a narrow hallway, the door slightly ajar. When he stepped inside, he was struck by how ordinary it looked. A bed with neatly arranged pillows, a desk cluttered with notebooks and pens, and a bookshelf overflowing with novels. It was the room of a typical teenager, untouched by the chaos that had engulfed her life. He moved to the desk, his fingers brushing against the spine of the open book. It was a fantasy novel, one he vaguely recognized from school. The pages were dog-eared, and a sticky note was attached to the margin of the last read page. In neat handwriting it read, "He waits where the stars align." Ethan frowned, his pulse quickening. The phrase felt significant, though he couldn't explain why. He scanned the rest of the desk, his eyes landing on a notebook with a frayed cover. Opening it, he found pages filled with sketches, strange, swirling patterns that seemed to twist and coil like living things. At the center of one drawing was a figure, dark and indistinct, surrounded by jagged lines that looked like cracks in the earth. His breath caught in his throat. It was the same figure from his visions. "Lily," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You saw it too." He flipped through the notebook, each page more unsettling than the last. There were drawings of burning cities, of people running in terror, of shadowy forms looming over them. The final page held a single sentence, scrawled in bold letters, "It's coming and no one is ready." Ethan closed the notebook, his hands shaking. He stuffed it into his backpack, glancing over his shoulder as though someone might stop him. The whispers in his mind surged again, louder now, urging him forward. "Did you find anything?" Mrs. Harper's voice startled him, and he turned quickly, hiding the backpack behind him. "Just a lot of books," he said, his voice uneven. She seemed like she loved to read. Mrs. Harper smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "She did," she said softly. "Thank you for trying, Ethan." He nodded, guilt gnawing at him as he left the house. He knew he should have told her about the notebook, but something told him it was safer in his hands. Whatever Lily had seen, it was connected to what he was experiencing. The signs were beginning to make sense, but the picture was far from complete. Back in his room, Ethan spread the notebook on his desk, carefully examining each page. The drawings, the phrases, the cryptic notes, they all pointed to something bigger, something dark and unstoppable. He felt a strange kinship with Lily, as though they were both caught in the same web of visions and warnings. But why had they been chosen? As he stared at the swirling patterns, a thought struck him. He opened his laptop and began researching the phrase from the sticky note. "He waits where the stars align." At first, nothing substantial came up, just vague references to myths and constellations. But then he stumbled upon a forum thread about celestial events and strange occurrences. One post caught his attention. "They say when the stars align in a perfect circle, it's a gateway, an opening for something that should never be allowed through." Ethan's blood ran cold. The images in Lily's notebook, the destruction in his visions, the figure's warnings, it all pointed to this. Something was coming, and it was tied to this celestial event. The whispers surged again, almost deafening now. "Beware the darkness," they said, their tone urgent. "Time is running out." Ethan clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Lily had been trying to warn people, and now it was his turn to pick up where she had left off. This was no longer just about him. The danger was real, and the world was running out of time. Ethan sat in his dimly lit room, the notebook spread open in front of him. The sketches and cryptic messages seemed to swirl under the flickering glow of his desk lamp. His mind raced as he pieced together what he'd learned. Lily had seen the same figure, the same destruction, and the same terrifying warnings. Her disappearance wasn't random. She had been silenced, removed from the equation before she could act. For what? And by whom? The whispers in his mind, once indistinct and chaotic, now felt sharper, more deliberate. Each time they rose, they carried fragments of urgency. Beware the circle. Look to the stars. Follow the girl. Ethan clenched his fists, his determination growing stronger. He wasn't going to let whatever happened to Lily happen to him. If the warnings were real, he needed to act before it was too late. The next morning, Ethan set out with the notebook in his backpack. His first stop was the local library. It wasn't exactly a cutting-edge research hub, but it had what he needed: quiet, anonymity, and stacks of old books that might hold the answers he sought. He sat at a secluded table in the back, surrounded by dusty tomes on mythology, astronomy, and ancient civilizations. He flipped through pages, his eyes scanning for anything that connected the stars, alignments, and destruction. After hours of fruitless searching, his fingers stopped on a passage in a book about celestial myths. When the stars form the circle of judgment, the veil between worlds thins. It is said that those who stand at the center will determine the fate of the earth. Beware the one cloaked in shadow, for they bring the reckoning. Ethan's pulse quickened. The description matched what he had seen: the figure, the destruction, the looming sense of finality. But the phrase "those who stand at the center" stood out. It sounded as though more than one person was involved, as if there were others who had a role to play. His thoughts immediately turned to Lily. She had been taken, or silenced, because she had been one of them. But if the figure had targeted her, that meant Ethan wasn't alone. There had to be others who had seen the same warnings, who carried the same burden. The whispers in his mind surged again, their message clearer than ever: the circle must not form. Find the others. Ethan's next stop was Mason's house. If there were more people like him, someone needed to know what was going on. He couldn't carry this alone anymore, and Mason was the only person he trusted. As he approached the familiar front porch, his heart pounded. He had avoided telling Mason the full truth for fear of sounding crazy, but now he didn't have a choice. Mason opened the door, his usual easy grin fading when he saw Ethan's expression. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping aside to let him in. Ethan didn't waste time. He dropped his backpack onto the couch and pulled out Lily's notebook, flipping it open to the drawings. "I need you to see this," he said, his voice tight. "And I need you to listen." Mason frowned, sitting down beside him. "What is this? Lily's?" "Yes," Ethan said. "She saw it too, Mason. The figure, the destruction, everything I've been seeing since the surgery. It's all connected." Mason stared at the swirling patterns in the notebook, his brow furrowed. "Wait, are you saying she what? Predicted something? Like a psychic or something?" "I don't know what to call it," Ethan admitted. "But she knew what was coming. And now I do too. Whatever this circle of judgment is, it's tied to the stars aligning. And it's bad, Mason. Really bad." Mason leaned back, his face pale. "Finn, this is? I mean, it's a lot. How do you even know it's real? What if it's just, trauma from the surgery?" Ethan shook his head. "It's real, Mason. I've seen things I can't explain. And it's not just me. Lily saw them too, and I think there are more people out there like us. But they're in danger. Whatever's behind this doesn't want us to stop it." Mason ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to process everything. Okay, he said finally. Let's say you're right. What do we do? How do we stop something like this? Ethan hesitated. He didn't have a clear answer. But he knew the first step was finding the others. We start by figuring out who else has seen the signs, he said. If Lily and I were chosen, there have to be more. The notebook might have clues. Mason nodded slowly, though his uncertainty was evident. All right, he said. I'm in. Just promise me you're not losing it, okay? Ethan managed a weak smile. I promise. That night, Ethan and Mason pored over Lily's notebook, searching for anything that might lead them to others. One of the pages held a list of initials followed by what looked like random numbers. Ethan's heart skipped a beat when he recognized one of the sets of numbers. It was the address of an abandoned church on the edge of town. This has to mean something, he said, pointing to the page. We should check it out. Mason hesitated. An abandoned church? At night? You sure about this? Ethan nodded. If there's even a chance it's connected, we have to go. Reluctantly, Mason agreed. They grabbed flashlights and set out, the notebook clutched tightly in Ethan's hands. The church was a crumbling relic of a bygone era, its wooden doors hanging on rusted hinges. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the overgrown graveyard surrounding it only added to the eerie atmosphere. Ethan and Mason exchanged nervous glances before stepping inside. The interior was dark and silent, the faint beam of their flashlights barely piercing the gloom. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by their movements. As they moved deeper into the church, Ethan's pulse quickened. He didn't know what he was expecting, but the oppressive energy in the air told him they were in the right place. Over here, Mason whispered, pointing to the altar. There, etched into the stone, was the same swirling pattern from Lily's notebook. Ethan ran his fingers over the carving, his breath catching. This is it, he said. This is what she was trying to tell us. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the whispers in Ethan's mind surged louder than ever. He stumbled back, clutching his head as the voices overlapped in a deafening roar. Mason grabbed his arm, panic flashing across his face. Ethan, what's happening? He shouted. Before Ethan could respond, the shadows in the room shifted violently, and the figure emerged, its presence darker and more oppressive than ever. You are too late, it said, its voice resonating like a thunderclap. The circle has begun to form. Ethan's heart pounded as he stared into the void where its face should have been. No, he said, his voice trembling but defiant. We're not too late. We can stop this. The figure loomed closer, its form towering over them. The choice is no longer yours, Ethan, it said. The reckoning has begun. The room seemed to tremble as the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving Ethan and Mason in stunned silence. The warning was clear. Time was running out, and the circle was already forming.